the Executive Director and Chief Curator of ALMA Lewis, and I would love to welcome you here this evening to hear Kleaver Cruz. And before Kleaver takes off with their presentation and wonderful conversation to follow, I just want to give you a little bit of background about Kleaver. Kleaver is our inaugural literary artist here at ALMA Lewis. Just thrilled to be kicking that off this year. And Kleaver Cruz is a lover of words and their meanings across languages. They were born and raised between the Bronx and Washington Heights in uptown New York City with their twin brother and close-knit Dominican family. Kleaver's brother, Walter, is also an artist, a wonderful visual artist. Kleaver is a Black queer creative writer and educator who has presented and conducted work across the African diaspora and continent in places like Brazil, South Africa, and the Netherlands, among other countries. Kleaver is the creator of the Black Joy Project. Okay, this is not tonight, but it is available on the website and White Whale Bookstore and a lot of other bookstores across the country. Right?
I'll get it too.
Yes, definitely. So the Black Joy Project, a digital and real-world affirmation that Black joy is resistance. Kleaver is also a member of We Are All Dominicans, a U.S.-based grassroots collective that works in solidarity with movements led by Dominicans of Haitian descent fighting for inclusion and citizenship rights in the Dominican Republic. Kleaver believes in the power of words to write the stories that did not exist when they needed them most. And I also would like to say that Kleaver is a nominee for the 55th NAACP Image Award for Outstanding Debut Author. I mean, how amazing is that?
And he's here in Pittsburgh.
Yes, and Kleaver's Black Joy Project just launched in December. Okay?
The book.
So
Yeah.
let's give it up for Kleaver.
Can you hear me? Testing. Boom. Hey. I always want to start with gratitude. Excuse me. So I want to thank Kilolo, who I met literally for one evening in 2018 when she was still at the Wilson Center, and we really hit it off. And then life happened, and the world shifted, and we didn't come back to each other until a couple of months ago when the last resident, Taj, who's in my book, I learned he was in Pittsburgh, and I'm like, what is Taj doing here? And so I learned about ALMA Lewis, and I came, and me and Kilolo had the same type of conversation again all those years later, and here we are. So thank you, Kilolo. I really appreciate it. And I also want to start with acknowledging the people I come from, always bringing them into the room. And particularly my most recent ancestors, who are Ramona Mojica Vizcaíno, Nelson Vizcaíno, Zoila Perez, and Ali Cruz, that their spirits are what guide me, that have led me to these places. And the pictures you see are everybody from my mom to my grandparents, my nieces, my siblings. It's just important for me to be present and to make y'all present, that I don't come in a vacuum or a silo. These are the people that made me, that sustained me, that maintained me, whether physical or spiritually. So I always want to start with acknowledging and thanking them, because they led me to this place, and they allow me to continue to be here.
Absolutely.
Also, to name the moment that we're in, that the world is on fire, and there's much conflict and distress in the world, and it's important for me too, that as much as I do work around joy, that for me joy is never separate or an escape from the things that don't bring us joy into the world. And that we have to connect these things. None of this is happening in isolation or in silos. That whatever is happening in the Congo is connected to what's happening in Palestine, that's connected to what's happening in Brazil, and so on. And so it's important for me, because my work around joy is to figure out how do we build solidarity and connection through those things, of how do we see each other's joys and defend that as a way to defend all of the other rights that are being violated consistently, historically. And then a little bit about me. So as my bio said, I'm from the Bronx, from uptown New York City. My pronouns are they, them. I guess now I can say I'm an author. not just a little wee writer. I'm going to start taking on amateur collages because being here in the last couple of weeks has been a really awesome way to lean into that, of playing with materials that already had purpose and meaning in another way and making it newly. Shout out to the people that remix those things. I love to travel, not just for pleasure, but to understand, particularly going to places where Black folks are, of how do I understand better and how do I complicate my own understanding of Blackness in those ways. And yeah, I'm a second generation American. My grandparents migrated here from the Dominican Republic some decades ago, and now I get to live in that legacy. And I don't take it lightly to have written a book in English when 2 generations ago people didn't even speak this language in my family. Yes, so my journey as a writer started in 1997, that good year. When Miss Fields, who I called the Black Miss Frizzle, if you ever watched the Magic School Bus or seen it, I had an amazing teacher in 2nd grade who read Still I Rise by Maya Angelou, and my 8-year-old self stood up. I felt like a shock through my system spiritually, like I needed to do whatever Maya was doing. And because I was blessed with Miss Fields, when I went to her and asked her, how do I become like Maya, Miss Fields? She said, easy, write a book. So I spent, I don't know how long that year, with Miss Fields' support, writing my first book of poetry called Through My Window, which is in the studio if you want to look at it. But yeah, so Miss Fields really opened a door for me. She woke up this calling in me about writing and putting words together to do something. Because 8-year-old me didn't know what Still I Rise meant, but I understood that there was something with words, especially if somebody can express them powerfully. So that was me, almost 30 years ago. Fast forward to 2014, I came across this novel called Into the Go Slow by Bridgette Davis, which is an amazing book if you haven't read it yet. But in this story, it takes place in the 80s, I want to say. It's about a sister her sister had died in Nigeria in the 70s studying abroad. She died in a car accident in the go-slow, in the traffic of Lagos. And so she goes back to figure out what happened to her sister. And while I was reading the book, they started talking about this festival called Festac 77. And so me being the nerd I am, I paused reading and I'm like, is this real? And I went into this hole and learned that this was real. And so I've spent this morning, actually, I realized it's been like almost 10 years of looking into this event of what is arguably like the biggest gathering of Black artists, intellectuals of the 20th century. Like we're talking about 15,000 people participated from over 50 countries and thousands more were in the audience, the Nigerian audience in Lagos. And that really blew my mind that this thing existed and we barely talk about it or know about it. And part of that is by design, that intentionally it wasn't covered in the mainstream media, and those types of things. So I just had a lot of questions. I'm a very curious person. So I've been looking into this since reading this book almost 10 years ago. And then in 2019, when I came to Pittsburgh, again, I'm a nerd, y'all. So even though I was working on other things, there's a big library at the university. So I went to the librarians and I asked them, do you know anything about Festac 77? And he was like, I'm not sure, but you should look at Bob Johnson's archives. And I didn't know who Bob Johnson was. So I did. So I started going to special collections on Friday mornings. And I learned that Bob Johnson, had attended this festival as a dancer for Sun Ra. He was part of his orchestra. So he already had been like touring the world with Sun Ra, and this was part of the work he was doing with him. But what's amazing about this is that Bob saved everything. He was a hoarder, and he saved everything from like the ID he kept from the event, pamphlets, all his like personal writings have really livened this thing for me of here's one person of thousands that experienced this. And he kept letters of the people he met, that they had all these exchanges through writing, and it got me thinking. So then from that research I was doing at Pitt, I got a grant in 2020 from Cultured Magazine to write about it. And so I spent like a month or so working on this article based on the archival research I had done. And I featured Bob Johnson and another woman, her name is Marilyn Nance, who's still alive. She has a book called The Last Day in Lagos that came out last year. She was the official photographer for the North American cohort. She actually had been admitted as an artist and at the last minute was taken out. And because she's a determined person, she found her way back into that event. And she just went on as a tech, as a part of the team. She was supposed to do 2 weeks, and she stayed for the whole month. This lady's fierce. You should get into her. But yeah, so I got to talk about her and Bob Johnson and the things I had learned about from the artist perspective. Because this event politically and in that realm is very complicated, and it's very much about Nigeria situating itself as essentially the heart of blackness at this moment. This is the moment after the Civil War in Nigeria, probably like 5 or 6 years later. So there's a lot of intention from the state to situate itself as the center of blackness. But my interest has been more from the artist, of reading all of these interviews and these types of testimonies and how all of them consistently talked about how life-changing this was for them to be around so many kinds of black people in this one space. People dancing all night and all day for like weeks. Those were their ways of communicating, was through music, through art. There was a huge art exhibition that was a part of it. There was a huge consortium. Almost every head of the then burgeoning Black Studies departments in the US were in Nigeria at the same time to intellectualize and figure out from that aspect of how do we define blackness on our own terms. That a lot of this event was from our own perspectives and stances. How do we define what this means in all of its complexity? That is just very fascinating to me because it didn't happen again, not in this way, not before and not since. And so then through all of that reading, my other question, as always, is where are the queer folks inside of this? And I didn't see it explicitly anywhere. So my thought, as usual, is to imagine it. I can imagine it into the story. So while I was doing that, I also started writing this book in 2020. And actually, there's a section where I talk about Bob Johnson and Festac as an example of a historic example of joy, of Black joy. But this book is a result of a project I started in 2015 because I woke up really sad. It's not like a big complicated story. I was just sad. And I was laying there because I couldn't move. And really, I describe it as a spiritual experience. Literally, the words black and joy floated above my bed. And then I remember this picture of my mom. And so I put it on Facebook with a stream of consciousness that ended up being a call to action saying that I wanted us to bombard the internet with joy, but not in a way that took away from or ignored the importance of sharing what was actually going on. Because 2015 is like the murder of Sandra Bland. Mike Brown had been a year already. But something was telling me that I needed to make space for that for myself, to heal, that I wanted to feel better. I just wanted to feel better. Because at the time I was part of community organizing. I was the regional director for this nonprofit organization, so I was managing like 9 people across 9 high schools in New York City, which was thousands of students. It was just a lot, and my responsibility was to inspire those people, but I wasn't inspired that morning. And so I was trying to figure out, because I had to get up, I have a job, I had to get out of my bed, and so I posted that picture, and I told myself that I would do that for 30 days, for the end of 2015. And after a couple of weeks of doing that, posting pictures of like my cousin and my mom and these types of things, people started reaching out to me saying, hey, like I had a really bad nightmare and these pictures calmed me down enough to go back to sleep. Please keep doing this. Or I had a friend who had just moved to South Carolina to work with Black girls there after this case. I don't know if you remember, but in 2015, there was a case of a high school girl that got slammed in her desk by an officer in the school. And so my friend Viv literally got on a bus from Brooklyn just to go hug that girl, and now has started an organization called Every Black Girl to support the girls in that part of South Carolina, but really anywhere, every Black girl, which she also gets talked about in the book, if you want to learn about that. But the point is that people like Viv were encouraging me, and so that's when I decided to make it into a thing, into the Black Joy Project. And it's been this journey of going and seeing and talking to people I never would have imagined, whether it was like somebody near a train station in the Bronx to like spending 2 hours talking to somebody about depression in Johannesburg, just all of these different locations and spaces, hundreds of people, a few people, a conference, a conversation. It's turned into a radio show, writing workshops, a gallery show. It's just become a lot of different things organically. And when the book opportunity came, it was opportunity to record that, but also explore further what does this mean. And so this book is it's like a remembering of the journey, but it's also an extension of what does it mean for real, and splitting it up into different themes I had noticed. So community, healing. My favorite one is called We Can Be Like Moss, which is chapter 6. But that one's about nature. And a lot of that actually started for me in Pittsburgh, of right around the time of the pandemic starting. And I had listened to this conversation, I think it was the summer of 2020. And this person, brilliant person, her name is Erin Lang, she was talking about how her mom's a therapist. And so she was talking to her mom about if we were to understand the function of racism or oppression, then we have to think about it as human to beast, because we're not being seen as humans. And so that's related to when people say things like, you're treating me like a dog. And she's questioning, why do we treat dogs like that? And as long as we're thinking that's okay to do to a dog, then it's okay to do that to a human. If you're okay with putting anything down that's alive, that comes back to us treating each other a certain way. And so for me was, if I'm being serious about liberation, about how we're going to treat each other, then I need to check in with my relationship to anything that's alive. So I literally spent like 3 months looking at moss on my sidewalk and plants and trees and all these things of being present, of like, there's actually a lot of life around us. And I needed to be connected to that, because there's a lot of things that disconnect us from that. And that to me is a small revolution to see moss break through concrete. And that type of thing, that to me is a demonstration of resilience. And that moss, I'm not going to nerd out too hard on moss, but moss is really interesting because it's considered a communal plant. It challenges Darwinism, this idea of like the most fit thing will survive, that moss actually works as the term is a colony. And that if one segment of the moss has enough moisture, it keeps the whole thing alive. And that until the rest of it can absorb the moisture. And I feel like people can learn from that. I think we can relate to that. And that sometimes moss is forced onto things. It doesn't occur there naturally, but it still thrives, right? That we know what that's like, whether it's to occur somewhere naturally or be forced onto a land and then figure out how to thrive and survive. I just wanted to explore what would that look like. And as a New Yorker, we don't always get associated with nature, so I had to challenge that. So the book came out last month. And yeah, I'm just really proud of it. I'm really proud of it. Check it out. If you like art, also I became a curator in the last 2 or 3 years of working on this book. There's over 100 pieces of art from 50 artists from all over the world, from Australia, different parts of the continent, the Caribbean, Europe, the US. All these people that I connected with in this conversation of Black joy, and in different mediums. So it ranges from collages to photography to watercolor, you name it. And there's archival too. Shout out to the Library of Congress. The idea is to create texture. My interest with writing is to create texture. What's the richness in something, so that nothing ever occurs as flat. And now we come back to here. So in my archival research with Bob Johnson and FESTAC in general, like I was saying, I've been imagining what does the queerness look like inside of that. I was like, we had to be there. We had to be there, especially if we're talking about art. And so I made up, these 2 characters started talking to me. One of them is named Taro, and the other one's Fortune. So I'm going to call the story Dear Fortune, and it'll be a series of mostly letters, but just things in general that people write to each other. So postcards and, I don't know, anything that people would mail to each other in the 70s and the 80s. But these 2 characters meet in my head. They meet at FESTAC. One is a dancer, and the other one is some type of visual artist. I don't know yet. This is like me playing with AI, so I made up these characters. They look real, but they're not. But this is me trying to render what could they possibly look like, which is a whole other fascinating conversation about AI and queerness and the level of prompts and things you have to. This was me attempting to render non-binary characters, and that's the closest I could get for now, which I thought was really interesting because they're still very masculine men identifying looking people. But anyways, the story is them getting to know each other, of what does it look like when 2 Black queer artists meet each other on the continent, and then they continue to connect with each other afterwards. And it's also a way for me to incorporate my archival research about the 70s, about Black queerness in the 50s, because these characters are going to be in their mid-30s, 40s, so their come up would have been a couple of decades before. which was just my clever way of trying to incorporate another time period that they could be reflecting on. So the story is just them writing to each other about their lives, about the different parts of the diaspora that they're traveling in whenever they're writing to each other. And then they're going to fall in love, which is nice because I don't write romance or romantic things. But yeah, they're going to fall in love. And what does that look like for Black queer folks to fall in love as artists, as people trying to make it through the world, to navigate the world at that time period? But, you know, it all connects. So even in this moment, what could it look like? And these are things you've already seen, some of you in person. But Kalolo told me it's called an installation, or it can be called that, so I'm going to start using that word. I just got interested in how do I brainstorm out loud. And so I asked Kalolo, can you put these shelves up? Thank you, Johnny. Can you put these shelves up on the wall behind me? Because I was thinking one part could be one of the characters and the other one the other, and how could they connect with each other? And so I already had my own collection of like books from the 60s and the 70s that I'm just interested in. So it felt like a way to connect that to these characters. So this will rotate maybe like once a month, what they're listening to and what they're reading as a way of trying to figure out what would they write to each other about or talk to each other about. Where would they be pulling from for their own philosophies and understandings of the world? So I tried to incorporate things like, it's really hard to see, but there's like a little tiny book that's blue in the middle on the right. It's in the room. But that's a book written by someone named Aida Cartagena Portalatin, who was a Black Dominican woman who wrote a lot of transgressive poetry during the dictatorship of Rafael Trujillo in the 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s. And she became very prominent for being so transgressive, of naming what did it mean to be a woman, a Black woman in that society in a moment where it was almost impossible to talk about that. So she wrote a lot of clever writing. Like this book is her writing an allegory about the story of Electra in Greek mythology to make a connection to what was happening under this dictatorship, which I thought is brilliant, and it's written in Spanish. But yeah, so books like that. This Sylvester poster that I found last week at a vintage store. And if you're not familiar with Sylvester, he's amazing and was a very openly Black gay person in the music world, in the art space. I feel like that's necessary to find the people who were unapologetic and what was that journey and how would they have influenced everyday people like these two characters that I'm making up. They would probably kiki and talk to each other about Sylvester. Did you hear the recent song? Have you bought the record? That type of conversation. But yeah, and so then also bring in my own records, vinyls from the 70s I already had. A magazine that I got my hands on from Black Market Vintage like 5 or 6 years ago. Ebony Magazine is like the only major publication that covered this event, and they did a full like 5 or 6 color page spread. The magazine's over there too if you want to look at it, but it's amazing. It's amazing that they covered it because so much of the mainstream media didn't, and the ones that did, like the New York Times, it was just not positive. It was mainly focused on people being disorganized or just like the not fun part of whatever that was, because I don't know, I'd give a medal to whoever can figure out how to organize 15,000 people in 1970 something from 50 countries. I would love to know how that writer would have did it, the journalist. But anyways, that's also to say that the journalism that covered it wasn't great, and it mostly wasn't Black voices. And the few times that it was when it was most enlightening. That's when they really talked about how powerful that was, how game-changing it was, how life-changing it was to be around so many kinds of people, so many kinds of Black folks at one time. And this is an event that lasted a month, so there was a lot to be said, and it's crazy that for a month of programming, there's barely any coverage of it, still to today. The other thing I've been doing is working on collages. So last year, I decided to make collages because I had all these random things in my head. And again, I like repurposing things that already exist. I find that really, really interesting. That something already had a life, and to give it another life feels like adding a layer to something that I find really interesting. And so, yeah, so I've been working on these collages. My grandmother, Soila, rest in peace, who passed away like 5 or 6 years ago, a couple of months ago, I was talking to my aunt, and I learned that her favorite flowers were sunflowers. And then I found this book at this bookstore in Shadyside for like $1 about sunflowers. And so I've been incorporating the sunflowers into all of these pieces as a way to connect with her. But it's also starting to play out as like a journey in the collages from the city to the country and vice versa. And she herself was a migrant from the Dominican Republic. That, yeah, it just feels like another conversation that's happening in my head or out loud. I don't know yet if it fits into Dear Fortune. It might. But yeah, it's just another way for me to get things out of my head. And that has been awesome, to play with paper and to go to the Center for Creative Reuse. Can't go there too often, it's dangerous. But it's been awesome to play with paper and figure out what are other ways. Because I really don't claim to be an artist or any of those things. I just be writing. But this has been great to play with visual things. But yeah, that's me. Thanks.
Okay, Kleaver. All right. I know I see some wheels turning in people's heads bluntly. And I'm just going to kick off with a question.
Sure.
Why collage?
That's a good question. I don't know how it came to me. I feel like I had tried it on my phone for 2 years ago. I think it was 2 years ago. For the Black Joy Project online, I decided for that year's Black History Month to make a digital collage, one for every day of that month. And so that got me thinking about like, oh, I can do this on my phone. But I'm old school in that way, and I like physical things, material things that, yeah, it just got me thinking. So what I was doing was just collecting things, and then last year I bit the bullet and decided to start making them for real.
And what was that process like for you to use your hands in a different way?
It was surprising because I realized it's the one place where Black men and boys show up the most in my work, and usually they don't. Because even when you read the book, it's very much heavier on Black queer folks and Black women, because that has been my experience around Black joy, that it's really interesting to see how that shows up in my collages. It's like another part of my brain and they seem soft in the collages, and they hold each other and they love each other. I love that.
Okay, great. Any questions? I was just trying to, help you all along as you gather your thoughts or comments, questions. I have plenty other ones, but I don't want to be selfish. So, yes. So I'm going to give you the mic because we're recording this.
So I've got about 18 questions. No, I'm just kidding. You're old dude. One question I want to ask is just a craft question about your book.
Yeah.
With an ambitious project that doesn't fall neatly into a particular category, how did you figure out the structure? You had the idea, you were already doing it. It wasn't like you did it just for the book, but how did you come to realize what form the book would be in?
This one or the one the Black Joy Project? That's a really good question. What I had done was figured out what if I could distill them into themes, what would it be like? What were the threads I had been listening or thinking about with the book? And then I went on Canva and I figured out how to visualize it, of like if I could make a visual table of content, which I pitched to the editor. It was figuring out what are these. It was really hard actually because they're all so connected. I was afraid of it all sound. It's like when you can't distinguish a character, that they all start sounding the same. But yeah, it was trying to distill it into these themes and make it distinct enough that it didn't feel like you were reading the same chapter over and over. If that makes sense. Yeah.
Can you tell us a little more about Dear Fortune? Do you think this is a book that we'll be able to find in the bookstore, or is it going to be a series of poignant objects that we'll see at an exhibition?
That's a good question. Definitely going to be a book. The Dear Fortune, part of it is it came from a few places. One of them was when I was looking through Bob Johnson's archives, I found this letter where this person was basically saying like, do you remember that day that we went to see Fela Kuti, and we couldn't get in, but it was raining and we sat across the street on a rooftop and listened. To me, that sounded like a date. That's very romantic. And so that got me thinking about like, where's the queerness in all of this? Because I was between two men that they were writing it. I don't know if they meant it to be romantic, but I read it that way. Like, could you imagine? It's raining and you're listening to Fela Kuti on a rooftop in Nigeria? That sounds amazing. That's iconic, actually. That moment got me thinking about that. And then there was something else I was going to say. It was just seeing a lot of these letters, not even just reading them, just seeing how the frequency that people wrote to each other, that got me thinking about, we don't, as much as we're so connected now, we don't do that. Like, that's such an art form to write a letter to somebody, and so vulnerable because you're really being who you are on a piece of paper. And that with Bob's, for example, he really, like, his close friends really wrote to him, and they were very intimate. Like, those are things I don't think they thought somebody's gonna walk over in 2020 something reading it. But just seeing the intimacy really touched me, of like, for people to be that open to each other, never expecting other people to see it either in that way too. I thought was really interesting and very moving. It was very emotional to read those things that, yeah, and then thinking about how many examples are there, and it's been hard to find outside of the 19th century, what are the epistolary examples? And really the main one is The Color Purple, and that was written in the 80s. That's my other thing too. I'm an Aquarius, so I like to be a little bit different. So yeah, that's my other interest, of turning it into a book of how, not just the letters, but the other materials. Like, there's a publication that came out in 2019 from this entity in South Africa called Chimurenga, and the book opens with a survey that the University of Lagos issued to participants of this festival. And so that got me thinking too, because something I did for another novel that I've worked on is writing all this background stuff that nobody ever sees to help me think like the characters. That got me thinking too of like, what if they filled out this survey? How would they answer these questions? So that'll be in the book too. Yeah, and like seeing postcards and all these different things, I just think is really interesting. Is the materialness of things makes it feel real. And and as a storyteller, that feels like another way to show instead of tell, without being super descriptive of, if you see the style of a postcard, that already is telling you something about somebody and why they would choose to mail that to somebody, how they wrote it. Like, with Bob's, it was so interesting. Some of his, he would write in diagonals to fit more into the postcard, which I had never seen. So just things like that tells you about somebody. I'm somebody that's willing to be outside the box and write in a diagonal versus trying to fit into this little box, which is totally me. I don't like fitting in boxes. That's what I want in the book. But now being here and learning about installations, that got me thinking too. So I don't know, it could be both. It could be both.
Anyone?
Yes.
I just want to say thank you so much for coming.
Oh my gosh.
It's very, your positive energy and your joy is here. And it's really very helpful to us who are attending. Excuse me. I knew Bob Johnson. He was married to a friend of mine, and I know his children well, and he would be so happy
Oh my
to know
God.
that you're doing research, because he was such a gifted dancer and a gifted choreographer, and he really believed in Black people and the Black diaspora. I mean, I don't know, my daughter-in-law told me to come here. I didn't know anything about anything. I knew Kleaver for 20 years, didn't know she was gonna be here, and I came here and knowing that I'm telling you that maybe I'm the messenger to tell you that Bob is saying thank you.
Oh my gosh.
It may not be a question, but the joy that you're spreading to us right now is just wonderful, and I think that that's what I'm supposed to tell you.
Oh my gosh. I really received that. Thank you. Thank you. I'm not gonna cry.
Don't cry, but keep doing what you're doing. Don't stop. It's just to see a young person so creative. And how did you get a book published?
Baby. Actually, it's funny. It's very a modern story. It started on Twitter, which I'm never on. But I worked in publishing for like a year and a half a while ago. Basically, I had this job, and it was killing my soul. And I was like, I need to go. I don't know what the plan is. And like a month or two after quitting with no plan, a friend of mine was working on a book, and he told me, like, you need to go be an intern at this thing. And I'm like, I'm about to be 30 years old. I cannot be an intern. And he's like, stop playing and go work at these people's place. And so basically, long story short, I ended up spending a year and a half working in publishing. And the woman who hired me, fast forward to 2020, she texted me saying, hey, I saw this thing on Twitter. You should check it out. So I did, and ended up being this editor, the senior editor, Rakia Clark. She made a call. I was like, I want to see work around Black Joy. And so I shot my shot, and I told her, I've been working on this thing for like 5 years. Wow. And we talked for like 2 or 3 hours, and then within a week, I had an agent and a book deal.
What?
It was insane.
That's amazing.
It was insane.
There's nothing. Toni Morrison didn't have that much success that way.
Okay. So yeah, it's been very much. That's what I was saying at the beginning. All of this to me has felt very spiritually led.
Absolutely.
It's very much God, the universe, making me a vessel for these things. Because half of the time I don't even know why it's me. I just know I'm supposed to be speaking on it or writing about it. Yeah, but yeah.
It's your attitude, because you're nothing but joy.
Thank you.
You're not bringing in any negative energy. You're not no negative thoughts, no negative phrases.
Thank you.
And the power of joy is just wonderful.
It's amazing. And I want to also say, too, about Bob Johnson, the more I learn about him is exactly what you said. I felt of how much he was so passionate about Black art as a way to preserve Blackness and as a way to move it forward, to expand, to explore, to extrapolate, that I just haven't seen in a lot of other people, that passion. And I'm not a dancer, but the way he so like strongly believed that Black dance was a way to communicate all of this, to me is very inspiring. And that I just feel it, how much he shared that with other people. That, yeah, it means a lot for you to say that. I appreciate that.
And I do want to say, just in disclosure about you, Kleaver, your birthday
Yeah,
is the embodiment of love.
that's true.
I won't say anything else.
We got it. We got it. As I was listening to everything you were saying and the comment, I thought of a quote from the sculptor Richard Hunt, who passed recently. And it really, to me, it was connected with your work. He said, to be creative is to not know what one is doing. The goal is to wander through the unknown, in search of the unknown, all while leaving your mark.
That really resonates. Thank you for that.
Anybody else want to share anything before we wrap up? Okay. Oh, Ricky, I think you're first.
Oh boy. Hey, I'm good. How are you?
Question. You have all these inspirations, these people that inspire you. Toni Morrison, James Baldwin,
Yeah.
Richard. When you're writing, do you ever say, what would Toni do?
I asked myself what would Toni do when I worked in publishing, because of, her time she was like the only Black person, period, not just Black woman, often in those rooms. But thinking about if she got to do all of that 50 years before I did, then I have enough strength to get to the rooms I need to be in. Even though I didn't have nearly as much power as she did as an editor. I was just like the lowly assistant or whatever. I think, with those people, I think, which is true from my own life, is how were they as people? How did they show up every day in rooms, and not just the things that we read about them or that type of thing? How do people write about how they made them feel? That's why I think about them. Is Toni was waking up at 5 o'clock in the morning to handwrite her writing before waking up 2 kids to take care of them and get them dressed so that she could go to work and be an editor and then drive across the river so she could be a professor at Princeton. That takes strength to wake up that early every morning consistently, and you don't know what these 2 other humans that are responsible for are going to be, what mood they're going to be in that day. that is really powerful to me, because I think she gets a lot of accolades as a writer, but as a person, she's amazing. You know, that Audre Lorde, talking about self-care, was dying from cancer, of her trying to survive this thing that she couldn't get out of her. Those types of things really stand out to me more than what they wrote or were able to beautifully articulate. Yeah. Thank you for asking that.
Well, Kleaver, thank you so much, and thank you for being here and gracing us with your presence. And you'll be here to the end of March?
Yes.
Yes.
And Thursday night at 7 p.m. is the book launch.
Yes, your first book launch.
It's the beginning of the tour.
The beginning of the tour is at White Whale Bookstore in Bloomfield. This Thursday at 7 o'clock. Right?
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Yeah. See you then. Thank you.